What is going on, guys? Welcome to the Wednesday night live stream. We have the one and only Lou on tonight. How are you doing today, Lou?
All right, Devin, I'm doing great. How are you doing in this time of the zombie invasion?
So far, the zombies haven't gotten me, so far so good.
Nice. Well, stay away from the zombies.
Yep, exactly. So, for those of you who don't know, Lou is the one and only main man from Tropic Marin, and he is a master on the carbon dosing, which is today's topic. Now, most people really only think of carbon dosing as dealing with nitrates, but there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot of different ways of carbon dosing. So we're going to go into that a little more today. So, Lou, how's
All
things?
right.
You good?
Good. All right. So this is a this is something I'm really passionate about
Mm.
because there's huge misunderstanding about carbon dosing and what it's for, how it works, what it does, and where it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody talks about nutrient reduction and nutrient export with carbon dosing. And it is true that it does lower the nutrient level.
Mm-hmm.
But the important thing to realize is that is not the most important thing it does. Okay. Now there's a reason that we think of it that way though. And it's good to kind of understand why we think of it that way. The reason we do is because carbon dosing comes from when we carbon dose in reef tanks, the the concept comes from large scale commercial aquaculture.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have these guys that want to grow 500,000 sun bass in a round tank, and they've got water circulating, and they're feeding them really, really fast because the more they feed them, the more they eat, the faster they grow, the
Mm-hmm.
quicker they get to market, and they make their money. So they overfeed them and really get them to grow quickly. And these tanks lock up with nitrates and phosphates from the food.
Mm-hmm.
And they found that if they did carbon dosing, that they could promote the growth of bacteria
Mm-hmm.
that would lower that nitrate and phosphate level.
Yeah.
And so this concept of lowering the nutrient level is key to where carbon dosing comes from.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I don't know for sure, but I think it's also the reason that it started out being done in reef tanks.
Hmm.
But it turns out it does a much more important thing. And what I'd like to do is I've got a little, I make these little animations, Devin.
Yeah.
I've got a little animation that will explain this
Mm-hmm.
in a little better detail. So let me bring my animation up here. Bear with me a second.
Okay.
Uh, and let's see now. Hopefully you see. Do you see a?
I see me.
You see me. There we go. How's that? Do you see
Yep.
periodic tables? All
There
right,
we go.
awesome. All right, so we all know about the periodic table. Okay, this is what we all learned in college or high school or grade school or whatever, depending on where
Mm-hmm.
you went. Now, don't freak out because I'm not going to talk about the elements and all of that. But what I am going to talk about is that this particular representation of the periodic table is what we all know and either fear or love. However, this is also a representation of the same data. It's just looked at differently. This is also a representation of that same data. There's many different ways that we can take the data and represent it. My favorite one is I love this one, but the one I really love is this one coming up. I think the guy that developed this had to be on something at the time that he was developing this. So this is the same data. We're just looking at it in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So what I want people that are watching this to realize is that we're going to talk about carbon dosing.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to look at the same data, but we're going to look at what it does in a little different way. Okay. Now, there's lots of ways to carbon dose. These are just a few of them. You got the vodka that people talk about. You have vinegar that people talk about. Sugar is a way of carbon dosing. And then there's lots of products that are made specifically for aquarium carbon dosing. They all work a little differently. So let's look at exactly how they work. Now, here's a coral polyp. There's some very, very rough kind of schematic representations here, but here's a coral polyp. The coral polyp has an excellent mechanism for taking nitrates out of the water column, okay? The problem is it doesn't really need the nitrates. Polyps can live and thrive in a zero nitrate environment. They cannot thrive in a zero phosphate environment. The problem is they have this great mechanism for taking nitrates out of the water column, and they have a lousy mechanism for taking the phosphates that they need out of the water column. Now we come along and we've discovered this beneficial bacteria, the good guys, the good bacteria. And it turns out that the good beneficial bacteria has exactly the opposite situation. The bacteria has a very, very effective mechanism for taking the phosphates out of the water column, and not such a great mechanism for getting the nitrates out of the water column. So what happens is this. Here's our good guy, our beneficial bacteria, and he goes around and he has this mechanism for taking all these phosphates and eating them and getting them inside of him and taking them out of the water column. When he does that, you're going to see the phosphate level in the water column go down. That's the nutrient export, the first part of the nutrient export that we talk about. So they can take some nitrates out of the water column, but they're more effective at taking the phosphates out. Now, here's our coral polyp out in our aquarium again. And out in the water column, you've got all that bacteria floating around. And our coral polyp is a filter feeder. So he's going to eat lots of that bacteria. Now, one thing that I like to point out is you'll see this little guy up here. And everybody talks about protein skimming when you're doing carbon dosing for nutrient export. Mm-hmm. So lots of the phosphates go into the coral polyp itself, but I put him up here because some of them are going to go out through the skimmate in the protein skimmer. So he's taking them out there. Now, this means now that all that phosphate is inside the coral polyp. And that's when you'll see, again, that phosphate level in the water column stay down because the phosphates went out of the water column into the bacteria, now into the coral polyp that really, really needs them. Now, the coral polyp, when it gets all of that additional phosphate, is going to be super happy. And it's going to start to grow and multiply, and the multiplication is going to grow. And when all of that happens, remember the polyps have a good mechanism for getting the nitrate out of the water column. That's going to now lower the nitrate level because we've grown so much additional coral. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's very cool that the carbon dosing lowers the nutrient level in the aquarium, but it's even cooler. And the more important thing is to give the coral polyp a way to get the phosphates that it desperately needs in our aquarium where we're keeping an extremely low phosphate level.
So it's almost better to think of it more as feeding your corals rather than worrying about the nutrients, right? Giving the corals the nutrients rather than trying to get rid of the nutrients.
Yes, and when I hear about so many people that are doing carbon dosing and running GFO, okay? Well, what you're doing is you're taking the phosphates out of the water column that you want to funnel to your corals. So you're playing both sides of the game and you're shooting yourself in the foot. You want your coral to be the one that takes those phosphates and nitrates out of the water column. You want those nutrients to go to your coral. Corals don't live in a sterile, extremely low nutrient environment. The ocean has lots of nutrients, lots of bugs, lots of bacteria. And so you want to create that type of situation for your corals. Now, I'm going to get a little bit brand specific here, Devin, and I apologize for it, but the reason I'm going to get brand specific is because, number one, I don't know about the other company's product. I only know about Tropic Marin. But more importantly, most companies make one carbon dosing product, and they say if you want to do carbon dosing, you use this product. Like use vodka or use
Mm-hmm.
vinegar or use sugar. When in fact, the type of carbon dosing that you want to do is going to be very dependent on what the phosphate level is in your aquarium currently.
Mm-hmm.
And if the phosphate level is too low and you do aggressive carbon dosing, you then start to feed the bad guys. You start to feed the bacteria and the algae that we don't want to grow because we don't have the phosphates for the corals to take them up. So it's very important to look at what your phosphate level is to know which product to use. And the reason I'm getting very brand specific here with Tropic Marin is that, as far as I know, we are the only company that targets different phosphate levels with different carbon dosing products. The last thing you want to do is put a bunch of vodka or vinegar or sugar into a tank that's got a 0.02 phosphate level.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that if you're at 0.2, but you don't want to do that at 0.02. So the way Tropic Marin does this is this. We have two products that are a little bit different when it comes to the type of carbon compound, the type of polymer that we're using to do the carbon dosing. These two products can be used at any phosphate level, high or low, and in fact, they can be used along with any one of the other carbon dosing products. So Reef ACTIF is the first one. And the reason this is such a mild, flexible type of carbon dosing, low risk carbon dosing, where you're not conflicting with your phosphate level and all of that, is because the polymers that are in Reef ACTIF are the same polymers that you'll find in seaweed in the ocean that do this naturally in the ocean. The very, very mild, very gentle way of carbon dosing, and it can be used at any phosphate level and with any one of the other products, other than the second one I want to talk about, which is our NP-BACTO pellets, which use the same exact polymer. So again, very, very gentle form of carbon dosing that can be used at any phosphate level. And in fact, you would use either NP-BACTO pellets in a fluidized bed reactor, or you would use Reef ACTIF. You wouldn't use both of those. Okay.
Mm.
By the way, if someone does want to use pellets for carbon dosing, you want to run the reactor at the minimum flow that you can run it, where all of the pellets are still fluidized. It's very important. We kind of have this notion in our heads that when you're running a reactor, you want to pump as much water through that as you can so that you can turn over the tank volume 3 times an hour, blah, blah, blah. It's actually exactly the opposite when it comes to carbon dosing with pellets. You want the water to run as slowly as possible,
Mm-hmm.
where all of the pellets are still fluidized. If they're not fluidized, they kind of glue together. And the reason is because you want the water to have the maximum contact time with the pellets. And
Okay.
if the water's running very quickly, then you don't get that contact time for the polymer to feed the bacteria. Where if the water's running very slowly, you get a much better contact time for it to feed that bacteria. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now we go into the different phosphate levels. Now, the first of our carbon dosing products that are aggressive is what we call Elima NP. This is very similar to vodka or vinegar or sugar dosing. It's very similar to many of the other carbon dosing products that are out on the market, with one difference. The type of polymers that we use, even though they're kind of alcohol and sugar based, are polymers that really target the specific type of beneficial bacteria very effectively. Okay. This is the most aggressive of our carbon dosing products, and you would use this if you've got a phosphate level of 0.1 or above. 0.1 or above. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, We should probably mention like what we consider the optimum phosphate level. Come to think of it, um, in my world, I like to see the phosphate level be somewhere between zero point zero 0.03 and zero point 0.1. Anywhere in there is good.
Okay.
If you're below zero point zero 0.03, the phosphate level is so low that your corals just can't get any phosphates. They're not going to be happy. If you're much above zero point 0.1, you then start risking uh, feeding phosphates to things like bryopsis and different types of algae that you might not want to grow.
Mm-hmm.
So somewhere between zero point 0.1 and at the lower end, 0.03 is good. A limit NP, the most aggressive type of carbon dosing you use if you're 0.1 or above. Now we've got that middle range where where you want your phosphate level to be, 0.03 to 0.01. We have this product called NP-BACTO balance. And what NP-BACTO balance does is that in addition to the carbon dosing, it adds a little bit of nitrates and phosphates so that it keeps you in that optimum range. If you just do carbon dosing, if you continue with the Elimit NP at 0.08, the phosphate level is going to continue to drop, and eventually you're going to get down to the undesirable range.
Mm-hmm.
So what the NP-BACTO balance does is to maintain that optimum range of the phosphates while you're still doing the carbon dosing so that you're funneling what phosphates you do have over to your coral polyps with the help of that beneficial bacteria.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Then we get down to the guys that have phosphate levels that are too low, below 0.03. Um, Very often we have people that are coming off of ultra low nutrient systems, and they need to get their nutrient level up. So what happens with the plus NP is that there is a small amount of carbon dosing in there,
Mm-hmm.
but there's much more nitrate and phosphate to help get that up into the desirable range. If your phosphate level is down below 0.03, your corals are not getting any phosphates and they are
Mm-hmm.
not going to be happy.
Okay, so there has been 3 or 4 questions come by in the last few minutes asking, what if I have phosphate but I have no nitrate? So is this, would you want to use those type of situations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The phosphate nitrate imbalance is a difficult issue.
Mm-hmm.
However, the important thing to realize is that the corals can live without nitrates. They cannot live without phosphates. So if you have a phosphate level in that 0.03 to 0.01 range, but your nitrates is close to zero, you're okay still. Um, but if you're the other way around and you've got a nitrate level and no phosphate level, now your animals aren't happy. You've got to get some phosphates in there.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so if someone, just because there's been so many questions on this, like one says I have 0 NO3 and 0.16 PO4, another person's 0 nitrate, zero point 0.2 phosphate. So does the plus MP actually add nitrates to the water as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it
Okay.
does. Yes,
Okay.
it does. It adds both nitrates and phosphates.
Okay.
Um, if the phosphate level is very low, below 0.03, and the nitrate level is above 0.1, like you said, you got a person at 0.1 something or
Mm-hmm.
0.2 something. If the phosphate level is really, really low, there are other ways to get phosphates into the system. A
Mm-hmm.
phosphate is a preservative, and phosphate is used as a preservative in many of the very, very inexpensive fish foods. And one of the things you can do when you want to raise your phosphate level is to buy a really inexpensive fish food
Mm-hmm.
and overfeed your fish. Um, I know it sounds crazy,
Mm-hmm.
but what I like about doing it that way is that it raises the phosphate level in a very natural way.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it goes through all the biological processes and
Mm-hmm.
ends up in the water column instead of you adding like a direct phosphate chemical additive, which is not my preferred way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So this very, very inexpensive fish food method, to me, is a really great way to raise the phosphate level if your
Hmm.
nitrates are already high. If your phosphates and your nitrates are extremely low, you just go with the plus NP and you're good.
Hmm. Okay. Now, you also said before, like, a lot of these products you don't want to use in combination with something like GFO.
Yes.
Now, if someone's using GFO, they might not really know if their phosphates are low or high because it's kind of superficial and being absorbed. So,
Yes.
would you want to stop using GFO and see where it's at, or would you just want to more ease into the product and ease off the GFO? Like, how would you transition from GFO to one of these forms of carbon dosing?
Great question, and I'm actually helping an aquarist with this exact issue right now.
Hmm.
A guy who's got this exact problem. Um, when it comes to all of the parameters that we look at, things like calcium and alkalinity, and phosphates and nitrates and pH, there are things about your system that are going to kind of make it want to be in a certain spot. Your system's going to naturally gravitate towards a certain pH. It's going to use a certain amount of alkalinity every day. It's going to use a certain amount of calcium every day. Um, it has kind of an equilibrium that it's looking for. And when you're running GFO, if you're running, this is true of carbon as well. Um, I don't like to see people run ferric oxide, hydroxide, or carbon on a 24/7 basis in a reef tank.
Hmm.
In a fish only tank, fine, no problem. In a freshwater tank, no problem. But in a reef tank, those chemicals are going to strip. You know, ferric oxide hydroxide does not take just phosphate out of the water column. It takes lots of things out of the water column. So carbon is very good at taking anything organic out of the water column. So those are all really good nutrients for your corals. So the first part of the answer to your question is, I personally don't like to see anybody running GFO or carbon or UV for that matter 24/7 on a reef tank. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, that being said, if you have somebody who's running GFO, you're right. They have no clue what their phosphate level is going to be if they don't run the GFO. And we know from experience, and you've heard me say this a million times, if there's one thing that your corals hate more than anything, it's change.
Hmm.
And going from a point 0.2 phosphate level, going from, let's say you're running GFO and you stop it and you go from a 0.03 phosphate level to a 0.8 phosphate level overnight is not something they're going to like.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even though you're going from bad to good, they don't like that to happen overnight.
Hmm.
And so if you're running GFO, and you want to do carbon dosing and you're worried about your phosphate level, you slowly, very slowly turn your reactor down over the course. The gentleman that I'm working with right now, I have him turning it down so that it's taking him 2 weeks to go to completely stop the flow in his GFO reactor.
Hmm.
You go that slowly. Every day you turn it down, or every other day you turn it down a little tiny bit, and keep an eye on your phosphate level. If
Hmm.
at any point you see your phosphates starting to rise to an undesirable level, you could then start your carbon dosing at that point, and continue to back off on your GFO. Um, it also, sometimes people are running Cato at the same time, and that's a whole other thing. This guy that I'm working with right now has no phosphate level, a very variable phosphate level, and he's running Cato and he's running um, a GFO. So
Hmm.
he has no idea where his tank wants to be. And
Yes.
so, so you want to try to work your way back to the equilibrium that the tank wants to have so
Hmm.
that you can then start to add the appropriate products to
Hmm.
get those ranges where you want them to be after you know what the tank's going to do on its own if you don't do that.
Hmm. Now, so you just talked about Shado. There's also comment about using an algae scrubber. Now, is it still good to use it in conjunction with macroalgae, or is it just another method of replacing a refugium or macroalgae, or was it better for them to kind of tag team work in tandem?
I'm a big fan of using both, and I'll tell
Hmm.
you why. Um, I'm not a I'm not I don't love GFO because it takes not just phosphates, but it also takes other things out of the water that
Hmm.
your animals want to eat, your animals want as nutrients. The reason I like the Kato solution or the algae scrubber solution is that if my algae scrubber is taking too much phosphates out of the water column and
Hmm.
I'm running down at zero point zero 0.02 or zero point zero 0.01 phosphate level, I just clean the algae scrubber out and get rid of some of the algae. And then I don't have that problem of the phosphates will come back up again. If I've got 2 pounds of Kato in my refugium and my phosphate level is getting too low, I yank a pound and a half out of there and give it to my friend.
Hmm. I did that
It's
today.
very, so I like the algae scrubber Kato solution because it allows me to adjust it naturally
Hmm.
and it works in a very natural way where GFO is just kind of I don't know what it's taken out of my water.
And the one other note with that too with GFO, you got to be careful because if you do too much of it, it can strip it down to zero fast, and you're gonna really harm your corals from that. So just if you do use GFO, cautiously.
Yeah, you can really harm your corals. And I'll tell you one other thing that I have seen happen so many times that I cannot totally figure out all of the science behind it. But I can tell you without a doubt, I've seen it now for myself
Hmm.
at least half a dozen, if not a dozen times. Somebody works really hard to get their phosphate level down. They go too hard. They get it down into the zero point 0.0 or 0.01 range,
Hmm.
and they start growing cyanobacteria like crazy.
Mm.
And then you bring the phosphate level up, and the cyano disappears.
So
And I'm
so not having phosphates can actually trigger cyano.
Yes. And now you're going to ask me how, and I'm going to have to tell you I have no idea.
No, that's fair. I have a little bit.
I,
I'm
I,
curious.
I have no idea, but I can tell
Hmm.
you I've seen it myself. I was working
Hmm.
with we have a coral farm locally that started up about I don't know, a couple of years ago. They had these brand new systems and they were scrubbing everything and they were being really careful about their nutrients. And they were having a terrible cyano problem that was right in front of the recirculation exhaust pumps in these big trays,
Hmm.
and it was you could see the cyano was growing exactly where the water was flowing really fast. And I looked at their system and I did a bunch of analysis and I said, I can't see anything wrong with your system other than you don't have any phosphates. And once you get coral, this was even before they had a massive amount of corals in the system. And I said, once you get corals in the system, your corals are not going to like that anyway.
Hmm.
So why don't you get your phosphates up into maybe zero point zero 0.05 range or zero point zero 0.08 range, and get it prepared for the corals. They brought their phosphate level up. The
Hmm.
cyano disappeared
Hmm.
immediately.
Interesting. I
And
know
I just don't know the science behind that, but I've seen it happen now more than once or twice.
there's the same kind of theory with dino as well, is that it's caused by either no nitrates or no phosphates. So it's something to do with that nutrient imbalance, one of them being not there at
Yeah,
all. So
yeah, exactly. So I'm not quite sure. I left this up for a while so people could copy it if they want to, but I think
mhm.
what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to you at this point here.
Sounds good. There's okay, so another question on that one earlier. They were
Do you have me
asking.
back again now?
No, I have me again. I got
You still
dual.
have me? Okay, how do I share
Stop screen
screen
sharing.
option? Stop sharing. There we
Yeah,
go. You have to put up with my technical challenges.
no problem. Okay, there's a question earlier. Do you really need a skimmer to do carbon dosing?
No,
Nope.
no, absolutely not. We get this question a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I have asked it many times of Hans Werner Bauling in Germany, um, because you hear a lot of people say you have to have a skimmer to do carbon dosing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it is true that when you have a skimmer, as I showed you, that little guy up on the right hand side there,
Yep.
um, when you have a skimmer, you will skim out a certain amount of nutrients as nutrient export
Mm-hmm.
as that bacteria gets skimmed out. But that's not the question you're asking. You're asking, do
Yep.
you have to have a skimmer to do
Okay.
carbon dosing?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to that question is absolutely not. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen a bunch of tanks have very, very good results with carbon dosing and no skimmer.
Okay. Now I know with like the little bio pellets, I know historically that was always a thing that you're supposed to put that output by a skimmer. Does that so that doesn't really matter with your version?
Not with our pellets, not
Okay.
with our NP-BACTO pellets. Now,
Okay.
the traditional bio pellet
Mm-hmm.
is a polymer from either
Mm-hmm.
potatoes or what's the other one?
Corn or
Uh,
something?
Corn.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Either
Mm-hmm.
potatoes or corn. And it is an extremely aggressive type of carbon dosing that does not do a very good job. I'm apologizing to all of the companies that make those type of pellets. But the simple fact of the matter is that that type of polymer does not do a very good job in targeting the type of beneficial bacteria that we're trying to target.
Mm-hmm.
The NP-BACTO pellets from Tropic Marin have that polymer from the seaweed.
Mm-hmm.
It does an excellent job of targeting the exact type of beneficial bacteria. There are a number of different types. It's not one type of bacteria that we're targeting,
Yeah.
but it does a very good job of targeting the type of bacteria that we're looking for. So there may be some truth
Mm-hmm.
to the average pellet that you find out in the marketplace maybe needs a protein skimmer or would greatly benefit from a protein skimmer,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not true of the Tropic Marin NP-BACTO pellets.
Okay. Now there's a couple questions that come up so far. If they overdose or overdo it, is it possible for carbon dosing to bring our nutrients down to zero?
There's two, I hate to say dangers of carbon dosing, but there are two dangers of carbon dosing. Um,
Consider
the
heavy considerations.
um, it's
Mm-hmm.
difficult to get to this stage, but if you overdose the carbon dosing,
Mm-hmm.
you can bring the nutrient level down to zero, and then you're still putting carbon polymers
Mm-hmm.
in the tank. And if there's no phosphates, those carbon polymers are going to feed something. They're going to
Mm.
start feeding the bad guys. They're
Gotcha.
going to start feeding bacteria. They're going to start feeding algae, bryopsis, green hair algae, purple
Mm.
slime, cyanobacteria, dinoflagellate, all of those guys that we don't want. And let me just make a little kind of a qualifying statement here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I said this in one of my other sessions with you, but I'm going to say it again in the hopes that you have different people watching this time, and we'll get the message to different people. So many people say, I want this tank in my living room to be this perfect little chunk of the ocean. That is absolutely not true. You want it when you put a reef tank in your home, you're trying to grow a chunk of the ocean that grows all of the things that you think look really beautiful and cool
Mm-hmm.
and doesn't grow any of the things that normally grow right next to that on a coral reef.
Solid logic.
You go diving on any coral reef in the world, and right next to the elkhorn and the blastos and the mushrooms and all of that, you're going to see green hair algae and bryopsis and cyanobacteria and dinoflagellates, and because it all wants the same conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes what happens is that the conditions in the reef tank are not optimum for growing the corals, and they're keeping the growth of the corals back, but they're also keeping those conditions are also keeping the growth of the hair algae back
Mm-hmm.
or of the cyanobacteria. Now we do some analysis, we do what we need to do to bring the parameters into line, and all of a sudden we start growing the bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
It happens sometimes. And sometimes you need to go through that stage and until you can come out the other side where you got rid of the cyanobacteria or got rid of the dinoflagellate or the bubble algae or whatever the list of bad guys that we don't want to grow.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes the very things that your corals needed to grow and thrive were the very things that the bad guys needed.
Mm-hmm.
And they're only bad guys because we don't like the way they look.
Yeah. It's true.
And so, I mean, a weed, what makes a weed, right? It's because
Hmm.
we want to grow flowers instead, or we want to grow vegetables, not the weed.
Hmm.
And so um, it's important for people to realize that sometimes when you're making the right changes and going from worse to better,
Hmm.
just because you get a green hair algae bloom or a cyanobacteria bloom doesn't mean you made a mistake. Sometimes it means you did exactly what you needed to do, and now you just have to get over that.
Hmm. Okay. No, that makes
All
sense.
right. So, can you overdose? To get back to your question, can you overdose carbon dosing? Yes.
Hmm.
Um, by the way, it is with our products, it is way easier to overdose a limit NP
Hmm.
and an NP-BACTO balance, which are slightly more aggressive
Yep.
than it is to overdose. Very hard to overdose the Reef ACTIF, the NP-BACTO pellets, and plus NP. Those
Okay.
three are much more difficult to overdose.
Okay. Now, on the, I guess, flip side of that one, there's a question on, is there any dangers of stopping carbon dosing abruptly, like instead of easing off of it?
Good question. I don't know.
Yep.
Um, I would say that my answer to that would be my general answer to everything when we talk about stopping it all at once.
Go slow.
Don't do it. Um,
Hmm.
corals don't like change, even
Hmm.
when they're going from bad to good, right?
Yep.
If you're, I mean, here's a good example. All right, let's say you weren't keeping a good watch on your salinity,
Hmm.
and your salinity in your tank dropped to 1.011,
Hmm.
and your corals and everything is looking crappy. The worst thing you can do is to do a 90% water change and bring it up to 1.025 overnight.
Hmm. Yeah.
Worst thing you can do, because your coral polyp is an animal that lives its life by osmosis and diffusion with its
Hmm.
environment. If you change the environment too quickly, you make too much of a difference between what's in the environment and what's in your coral polyp, and your coral polyp shrivels up and dies or blows up and dies.
Hmm.
And so and so quick change is never good. I don't know what the ramifications of stopping carbon dosing overnight is, and I
Hmm.
never want to find out because I would always say go slowly. If
Yep.
you want to stop carbon dosing, back off of it very slowly, as you would any other change that you're going to make in your aquarium.
Hmm. No, I agree with you on that one. Any abrupt changes is usually trouble.
Always trouble. I
Always.
mean,
Yeah.
and it's hard because we want to fix these things overnight.
Hmm.
And what I'm always telling people is you didn't create the problem overnight. It's not going to go away overnight. It
Hmm.
took you months to cause this problem. It took you months for your tank to get to where it is right now. You should take at least weeks, if not months, to correct it.
Hmm. No, for sure. No, wise advice. Okay, Stutterfly, how to safely switch between carbon dosing sources, for example, going from pellets to a liquid carbon dosing.
Good question. I can only answer this question in relation to our products.
Yep.
And if we're talking about some other companies' pellets and some other companies' carbon dosing liquid or vodka or vinegar, what I'm about to say is not true.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I want to really be clear about that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Tropic Marin has studied this and looks at it in a different way than most companies do. And our product line in carbon dosing is different than most companies. And
Mm-hmm.
so I want to be really clear that my following comments are about our products only. Um, the the question about the pellets would be that you can use the pellets along with one of the other products, and
Mm-hmm.
so there's no need to get rid of the pellets. I love the pellet approach because once you have it set, it works on its own. You don't have to do much to it.
Can
You're
you
not
add too many pellets, or you just top it
can
off once in a while?
you can.
Okay.
Um, what you do is the pellets are gonna go down, and every few months, every 6 or 8 months, you're gonna have to put more in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you can overdose it. You can add too much. But when we came out with the pellets about, God, came out with the pellets probably 5 or 8 years ago. When we first came out with them, I was running a little 29 test reef, and I put I think 3 times or 4 times the amount of pellets that I was supposed to see what would happen, to see if I could overdose it, and it was still fine.
Oh,
So
okay.
the pellets, our pellets are a very gentle form. They can be overdosed, but it's relatively hard to overdose them. But the general rule with carbon dosing, and this is good to follow no matter whose products you're using, ours included, the general rule with carbon dosing is that less is more.
Mm-hmm.
If the product says, if you've never carbon dosed a tank and the product that you're going to add says add, by your calculation, 10 milliliters a day, start by adding 3 milliliters every other day and
Mm-hmm.
see how your tank reacts. You know, again, no quick changes. Go
Yep.
slowly. Go
Ease into
slowly.
it. Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, as far as switching from one to the other, because we address the product to use by the phosphate level,
Mm-hmm.
that's what your rule of thumb is. If you're using our Elima NP because your phosphate level is 0.13 and it's working really well and the phosphate level is dropping and you get down to 0.08,
Mm-hmm.
start using the NP-BACTO balance. And you can just come right off of one and right into the other.
Okay.
And if you're using the NP-BACTO balance and you have tripped something in the tank and all of a sudden the phosphate level is continuing to drop and you get down to 0.02, go to the plus NP. Don't
Mm-hmm.
use the NP-BACTO balance, go to the plus NP. So for our line of products, you can quickly switch from one to the other depending on what your phosphate level is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. So that's nice and easy. As your tank progresses, goes up or down in nutrient levels, swap over the next one, not a big deal.
And what you'll find actually in most cases is that once you can work into that 0.03 to 0.1 range and and you're using the NP-BACTO balance, it kind of tends to stay there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it doesn't bounce around a lot because you're both carbon dosing and giving it some nitrates and phosphates, so it tends to kind of equalize a little bit.
Balance it. Okay, that makes sense. This one's directly okay. So, Mr. Moo, could Lou comment on the buildup of bacterial film when using carbon dosing? In the past, no pox left white film on my rock.
Okay, I can comment on that, but I'm going to be very careful here.
Okay.
This is what I mean when I talk about targeting the right type of bacteria. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It happens sometimes. You could grow any kind of bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I love our products so much is because the type of polymers that we use have been proven to specifically target the beneficial bacteria that we want to get to eat it.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of vodka, vinegar, and sugar.
Because they just target everything. There's no specifics.
Because they're really good polymers to grow all kinds of bacteria.
Okay, so if
sugar
feeds everything,
sugar grows everything.
Mm-hmm.
Sugar grows everything. It doesn't target anything.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to say that certain products cause incorrect bacterial growth. I'm not going to go that far, but I will say that
they just feed all bacteria.
Yeah, and some of that's going to be what you want to grow, and some of it's going to be what you don't want to grow.
Okay, no, that makes sense. It's a good way of putting it. Okay, question from David. I've always run GFO because it's the only thing that keeps my PO4 below 0.1. Could I substitute Elimi NP on a regular basis?
That would be exactly what you would want to do. So, and the advantage of doing that is if you're running the GFO, you're exporting that extra phosphate, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The way you're keeping your phosphate level down is by throwing it out. It's going in your GFO and then you're dumping your GFO. Your corals need that phosphate. So wouldn't it be better to give the bacteria what it needs to grow so that it eats the phosphate, getting the water column phosphate down, and then your corals eat the bacteria, getting the phosphate that they need. Now, the phosphate in the water column goes down, but it doesn't go down by you throwing it out. it goes down by the corals eating it and getting what they need.
I like the idea of thinking about it as more feeding your corals rather than just worrying about the nutrient levels. I find it
I
a
mean,
much.
it's a really nice byproduct that it lowers the nutrient levels. If your nutrient levels are too high, that's really awesome. But
Mhm.
that to me is a byproduct. The more important thing it does is to get the nutrients that your corals need inside of them. It gives the
Mhm.
coral polyps a way to get the nutrient that they need so much.
Yep. No, and that's a great way of thinking about it. And I don't think many people think about it that way. So
Almost
that's a great one.
nobody,
Mhm.
and we don't in general, because the big thing everybody talks about is nutrient export, because
Mhm.
that's what it comes from. That's what it was
Mhm.
originally used for.
Yep.
It actually does something more important.
No, which is awesome. So there you go. Might not even be worrying about it. Might just use the very subtle ones as a coral food rather than worrying about the nutrient aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean it's not directly a coral food, but what it does is to grow the stuff that
That the
is the
coral eat.
coral food.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
indirectly it is.
Yeah, yeah, indirectly.
Yep. All right. So using the product just based off PO4 levels, I have 0 NO4, which we've discussed this one. PO4 is 0.15, so eliminate MP.
Yes.
Yep.
Yep, that's a perfect situation to use the limit NP. And then when you get the phosphate level down, don't, I mean, we say, okay, use the NP-BACTO balance when it gets down under 0.1.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're coming from 0.15, don't quickly start NP-BACTO balance when you get down to 0.1. I'd
Mm-hmm.
let it go to maybe 0.8 or 0.7, maybe even 0.6
Mm-hmm.
before I started the NP-BACTO balance. Then use the NP-BACTO balance. And then if it goes out of that zero point 0.1 to 0.03 range, then you go to the other product that's appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense.
It's really pretty simple. People
Mm-hmm.
make this, they look at the fact that we have 5 carbon dosing products and they say, oh, it's too complicated. It's really simple. What's your phosphate level? Use that product.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There you go. You use the one that's right for your current situation.
Exactly.
All right. Okay. Another one for you. Okay. I know this is off topic, but I wanted to ask Lou if I'm dosing Kalkwasser, should I dose Tropic Marin Part C? I'm concerned about ionic balance and trace elements.
Uh, okay. Um, so if Kalkwasser is being used as the primary or only source of calcium and carbonates,
Mm-hmm.
it's not my favorite way to do it. And first, I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to go a little deeper into Kalkwasser. So, the answer to the question is no, you don't need the part C from the Balling method when you're using Kalkwasser. When you need the part C is when you're using a 2-part additive, where the first part is calcium chloride and the second part is sodium bicarbonate or sodium carbonate. Okay, that's when you get the ionic imbalance, not
Mm-hmm.
with Kalkwasser.
Okay.
Right. So there's no, to answer the question, there's no need for the part C with Kalkwasser as the primary source of calcium and carbonates.
Okay. All
Now,
right.
I don't like using Kalkwasser as the primary source for 2 reasons.
Mm-hmm.
One reason is it's very dilute. And often in a well-growing reef tank, you're putting it in your top-off water. You need 2 quarts of top-off water every day, but you need 3 quarts of Kalkwasser solution in order to meet the calcium demand.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the first reason I'm not so crazy about it. But there's a more important reason, and I'm not so crazy about it, which is this: when the Kalkwasser goes into solution, you're releasing a ton of hydroxide ions, OH ions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those hydroxide ions are going to artificially raise the pH in the tank.
Mm-hmm.
So now that means, now a lot of people use it exactly for that reason,
Yep.
because they say, oh, it's great because it keeps my pH up at 8.4. The problem is that I don't know where the tank is going to be if I don't add the Kalkwasser. And
Mm-hmm.
if I add more or less Kalkwasser today, what's my pH going to be?
Mm-hmm.
And the animals hate a range of pH that goes up and down too much.
Yep.
So what I would like to do is I'd like to get the pH in the tank to be stable,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere between, I'm going to say, and don't freak out here, Devin, but I'm going to say somewhere between 7.8 and
Mm-hmm.
8.4.
Mm-hmm.
7.8 to 8.4 with usually a drift of about 0.2 from the morning to the evening.
Okay.
Okay. As long as my pH is doing that, I'm good. I don't need to raise the pH. Now, would I rather have it up at 8.2 to 8.4 instead of 7.8 to 8? Absolutely. But I know a lot of tanks that run at 7.8 and run just fine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what I don't like is to artificially push it up. And then if I add more, let's say it's summertime and my air conditioner's on and I need more top off water now. And so now I got more kalkwasser going in and now my pH is going too high.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's wintertime and or it's summertime and I'm in a humid area and I'm not using as much kalkwasser in my top off water. Now my pH is dropping. I like the tank to be stable on its own. If your tank, listen, reef tanks, and when I talk about alkalinity and pH, I've got a whole presentation. I think we went through it one other session. Um, your tank really wants to be 8.0 to 8.4.
Mm-hmm.
It really wants to be there. And if your tank is not that, then we need to figure out why the pH is running low in your tank. Could be
Mm-hmm.
CO2 pooling, could be bad circulation, could be bad aeration, could be any number of different things. But if your tank is not running 8.0, there's a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to figure that out, fix that, and then you don't need the kalkwasser to raise the pH.
So so here's another side question. So a lot of the stuff you mentioned using kalkwasser as a primary, what if it's a supplemental on the side? Does that change anything?
It depends on how much they're using
Mm-hmm.
and whether they're using it to really affect the pH. If
Mm-hmm.
they're just using it to add a little extra calcium in, fine. It's easy. You put it in the top off water and it's really dilute. That's fine. But
Mm-hmm.
if they really need it to
Mm-hmm.
push that pH up, and that's why they're using it,
Mm-hmm.
call me and I'll help you figure out what the pH problem is in the tank
Okay, so
because we need to
on
fix that
this,
first.
so one tank I have a calcium reactor, which I know is why my pH is lower. Am I
Yeah.
the one I'm dosing and it's not as low? So I mean dripping in that 6.5 pH water all day certainly doesn't help pH.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and now we get into the whole question of calcium reactors,
Mm-hmm.
which is a whole different subject. And unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
I have to tell you, we don't make Tropic Marin doesn't make a calcium reactor,
Mm-hmm.
and so I don't know a whole lot about them.
Mm-hmm.
What I will tell you is I work with a lot of people who have had trouble getting that regulated to work the way it needs to work. The problem is I can't help you with that because we don't make a calcium reactor and I know nothing about them other than they cause problems all the time. But I don't know how to tell you how to fix it because we don't make them, so I don't know anything about them.
Okay, fair enough. I I was just laughing on the kalkwasser because I've actually been debating trying a kalkwasser reactor just to boost up my pH. So I was laughing
Yeah.
at the side thing.
So my suggestion for you
Mm-hmm.
would be fix your calcium reactor so that it's not constantly lowering your pH. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're not able to do that, what size is the tank?
200 ish.
Yeah, well, if you're not able to do that,
Mm-hmm.
let's get you on a dosing pump with carbocalcium and forget about the pH problem is gone.
Yeah.
All right. So
Mm-hmm.
it you want the tank to hold the pH by itself.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want it to depend on you adding something to
Yep.
be at the right pH.
Mm-hmm. No, that's fair. Okay. So end of the day, all about stability of pH, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of what it is. And then in your opinion, 0.2 is basically an acceptable swing.
In most of the tanks that I see that run smoothly,
Mm-hmm.
there's usually about a 0.2 swing from morning to evening.
Okay. Yeah, that's about right.
I mean, you're going to get that because of the CO2. It's going to
Mm-hmm.
happen. It's natural. Yes, it's a little bit more than what you would see on a reef in the ocean,
Mm-hmm.
but um, it happens in all reef tanks. I don't see it ever being a problem as long as your swing is in a reasonable range.
Okay.
You know, if your upper end is 7.8 and the low end of your swing is 7.6, we need to talk.
Mm-hmm.
But if your low end is 7.8 or 7.9, I've never seen that be a problem.
Okay. No, that's good to know. I guess another good question would be, at what level would you consider it too low?
pH?
Yeah.
Anything under 7.8.
7.8? Okay.
I've never, I know a million tanks that run at 7.8 as the low end are fine.
Mm-hmm.
I've rarely seen a tank run under that and be fine.
Mm-hmm.
Would I rather see you at 8.0 and 8.2? Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
But no, I know a lot of people, you know, they freak out when they go from 8.0 to 7.8.
Mm-hmm.
There's no need to freak out.
All good.
Below 7.8,
Mm-hmm.
need to do some homework and get things cleaned up.
Okay. No, that's fair.
But I don't think down to 7.8 is a critical issue at all.
I had 7.78, just under.
Yeah, well, but if that's really where it's looking,
Yep.
then I would really seriously look at
Mm-hmm.
how do I fix that issue, because I'm skirting some danger there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm right on the edge. And if that rock on the edge of the cliff moves a little bit, I'm gone.
Yeah.
You know, so I would definitely want to see you fix that.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. Okay, now I had a few questions earlier before the stream started around alkalinity.
Okay.
And one of them was asking if you could dive a bit deeper, basically into the ionic balance around alkalinity, and kind of also have them talk about the Balling method approach to alkalinity and what components their solution has in it.
Okay, so alkalinity, you want to think of alkalinity as kind of pH in reserve.
Mm-hmm.
The alkalinity is the pH buffering system. And the reason reef tanks work so well, and the reason reef tanks want to be at the pHs that they're at, is that there's a lot of calcium carbonate in the tank.
Mm-hmm.
In the corals, in the rocks, in the sand, there's calcium carbonate all over. And that calcium carbonate and the carbonates that are in the system help to keep the pH where it is.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, it is true that at higher alkalinities, pH tends to move less. But more importantly, the way you want to think of alkalinity is that when the pH goes down, alkalinity will convert into pH and lower.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
So it's like you have two barrels. One barrel is your pH barrel and one barrel is your alkalinity barrel, and there's a pipe that goes between the two. If I take water out of the pH barrel, lowering that level, the water from the KH barrel, the alkalinity barrel, is going to come over and fill it back up again, but that barrel now went down some.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the way pH and alkalinity work.
Okay.
Now, the way the Balling method deals with alkalinity is that the part B is mostly sodium bicarbonate. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a difference between adding bicarbonate and carbonates, bicarbonate and sodium carbonate to your system. When we talk about sodium carbonate, some people call it soda ash. That's another term we use for sodium carbonate. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Sodium carbonate really adjusts your pH quite a bit. Sodium carbonate raises the pH quite a bit. These cichlids that you see behind me
Mm-hmm.
are all Lake Malawi. Oh, there's one Tanganyika cichlid in there, but they're one Victorian cichlid in there, but they're all Lake Malawi cichlids. Now, Lake Malawi cichlids like a very high alkalinity and a very high pH. So whenever I add top-off water to this tank, this freshwater tank,
Mm-hmm.
I put soda ash in it. I put sodium carbonate in it because it helps push the pH up, which is
Mm-hmm.
where the guys like it.
Yeah.
In a saltwater system, it's preferable, in my opinion, to use sodium bicarbonate because that helps build the alkalinity rather than adjusting the pH.
Mm-hmm.
The way the Balling method handles alkalinity is that the part B is sodium bicarbonate,
Mm-hmm.
and it gives you those carbonates that build the alkalinity.
Yeah.
Did that answer that question?
Well, okay. I got a secondary part on this one. Now, what about mixing the carbonate and bicarbonate, trying to get more of a blend of the two versus just
Yeah.
one or the other?
In my opinion, that's fine as
Mm-hmm.
long as you don't use too much of the sodium carbonate.
Okay.
If it's largely sodium bicarbonate with a little bit of sodium carbonate in it to maybe nudge your pH a little bit, that's fine. But
Mm-hmm.
just like I don't like using Kalkwasser, sodium hydroxide to bring the pH up all the time, I
Mm-hmm.
don't like using soda ash to constantly push the pH to a place that it doesn't want to naturally be.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, is that mainly just because it's going to fall back down anyway, so it's only a temporary fix?
Yes, and it's a direct adjustment from something I'm putting in,
Mm-hmm.
and it's something that the tank should be maintaining on its own. So like it's different than like calcium and alkalinity. Calcium and alkalinity are going to get used every day in the tank,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to add it every day in the tank to replenish it. All right, the tank is not going to reach an equilibrium with calcium and alkalinity because it's going to constantly get used.
Yep.
Wouldn't that be nice?
It would be.
But the pH, depending on if you're maintaining the alkalinity,
Mm-hmm.
there should be an equilibrium to the pH in the tank where the tank wants to stay at a certain pH.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I'm adding something directly to adjust that I don't
Okay.
like to. That's different to me.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair. Okay, I get your logic on that one. Okay, so another question, one of the earlier ones. So if a coral takes up alkalinity calcium at perfect 1-to-1 ratio, why do we see some tanks dosing twice as much alkalinity as calcium?
Good question. Um, First of all, I don't believe that it's an actual 1-to-1 ratio, but there is a
Yeah.
certain ratio.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, and when we talk about the Balling method and we mix up a part A and a part B and a part B C solution, um, the reason it's easy to think about 1-to-1 is because if you're going to need 10 milliliters of part A, you
Mm-hmm.
should need 10 milliliters of part B to equalize it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the question is a really great one. Why do so many tanks need so much more part B,
Mm-hmm.
alkalinity? And it's because of this. There's only two things that can take calcium out of the water column. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Calcification, either
Yeah.
biological calcification in the
Mm-hmm.
corals or calcification in the form of precipitated calcium carbonate.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the only two things that can take calcium out of solution. Now, those two things also will take alkalinity out of solution in that so-called 1-to-1 proportion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But in addition to those two things, CO2 pooling, bad circulation, bad aeration, there's a whole number of things that can also take alkalinity out of solution.
Okay.
So in a lot of tanks, the system itself, the tank itself, will use more alkalinity per unit of calcium than the corals are actually using.
Huh.
Okay, does
Yep.
that make sense? Because you've got calcium and alkalinity going into the coral,
Mm-hmm.
and then you've got all these other things taking additional alkalinity.
Yeah.
So the corals are using a certain amount of calcium and alkalinity, but the system as a whole
Mm-hmm.
uses more alkalinity per unit of calcium than the corals themselves are using.
Interesting. I've never considered that view or aspect of it. Huh. Crazy.
Yeah, it's very prevalent to see a tank here in the U.S. use more Part B
Mm-hmm.
than the corresponding amount of Part A.
I've always been a little bit higher on the elk side of it, so same thing.
Yeah, it's because there's a little bit of an imbalance in the tank somewhere when it comes to one of
Mm-hmm.
those things that I'm mentioning.
Yep. Okay. Nice. Um. Okay, another question Roberto was asking, this was from earlier. Carbocalcium. I have a high stock SPS tank. I'd like to try carbocalcium. After dosing, how long does it take for the elk to be available to the corals?
Um, the answer to the question is I don't know exactly, because
Mm-hmm.
every system seems to be a little different. And we're really just learning the way this works. And
Mm-hmm.
um, here's the really kind of interesting thing that we're learning about carbocalcium and Reef calcium formate, which
Mm-hmm.
is both of those products are based in calcium formate. So what this person is asking is the calcium formate goes into the solution,
Mm-hmm.
then goes into the tank. The calcium gets used. The formate gets metabolized by bacteria into the alkalinity.
Mm-hmm.
And he's asking, how long does that take to happen? That's true that it works that way. And in general, you will see most of that alkalinity show up in, say, a day or two.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, a day or two. But here's the interesting thing about the way formate works. What we're finding is that the alkalinity that is created by the formate is much more effective in, not much more effective, in some cases, is very effective in going directly into the coral polyp
Mm-hmm.
rather than showing up in the water column.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, the coral takes in the formate, and in some cases, let me just kind of preface these comments by saying that we are really, really just learning about this.
Mm-hmm.
This is super cutting edge stuff, and we're just kind of starting to understand the way this works fully. It seems that the formate, a certain amount of the formate, goes into the coral polyp and gets converted into the alkalinity that the coral polyp needs inside the coral polyp.
Yeah, crazy.
So what you actually see is not the alkalinity from the formate showing up in the water column. You see a slowdown in the amount of alkalinity that the coral polyps take out of the water column, because they need less from the water column because they're getting it directly from the formate.
Crazy.
It's really crazy. And in fact, we are working on the development of a new alkalinity test
Mm-hmm.
where we can actually look at this particular function, because the current alkalinity kits don't tell the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
All they tell you is how much carbonate's in the water column.
Yep.
They don't tell you this whole story of the other ways alkalinities being funneled to the coral polyp. So we don't have
How
it.
would you test for that?
Well,
Like,
we're working on it.
okay, okay. I,
What the stuff that we're talking about now is really, really on the cutting edge of
mm-hmm.
this formate technology, and we're just starting to understand the way it works.
Mm-hmm.
But it's super cool. It is super effective, and we have lots of systems all over the world that are running carbocalcium and Reef, for that matter, and having tremendous success with tremendous ease. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
so super easy to use these kinds of products.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, this person that asked this question about the alkalinity, did they say what size tank they have?
No, they did not.
Uh, if it's a larger tank
Mm-hmm.
and you're going to use the carbocalcium,
Mm-hmm.
seriously think about adding the trace A and trace K elements to the carbocalcium solution,
Can you mix
and
it
then
all together?
you can mix it all together.
Nice.
That plus magnesium is what Reef is.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you can mix it all together, and then you have one solution that's dosing your calcium, your alkalinity, and your trace elements.
That's nice.
And for smaller systems, the Reef doses calcium, alkalinity, trace elements, and magnesium.
Mm-hmm.
You have one solution that's giving you pretty much everything you need. But
Nice.
didn't mean for that to be so product oriented. But if it's a larger system and you're going to go to carbocalcium, it's a no brainer to add the A and K trace elements to it.
Mm-hmm.
And now you got one solution that's doing everything that you need mineral wise except magnesium. And that's
Perfect.
awesome solution to the problem.
No, that's awesome. Nice way to do it. Okay, quick question. Lewis, we totally talked about this one, but thank you for the 499 super chat. He said, not sure if this was covered. 20 cube, all in one, no skimmer, nitrates undetectable, phosphates 0.38, try GFO, no lacqualoring. So the eliminate NP is 100% what you want for that one.
Yes, but
But
why did GFO not lower that phosphate level?
that is a good question.
Okay, so when I hear that, I start wondering about testing methodology.
Mm-hmm.
Is the testing being done in a way that it's giving valid results? And to this person, I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong. I'm just saying that if you have a high phosphate level and you put GFO on there and it's running through a reactor properly, that phosphate level should decrease.
Mm-hmm.
So if it didn't decrease, something is not quite right. And we need to kind of figure that out before we start throwing spaghetti at the wall. We need to try to figure out what's going on. Did we get a proper reading? Did we not get a proper reading? Maybe the phosphate level really isn't that high. Maybe our phosphate test kit is crapped out in its reagents. Any number of things could be wrong, but I would first go back to that statement. GFO made no change in the phosphates. Try to figure out what's going on there.
Yeah, or how much GFO, or how high was it prior to GFO to make a change, right?
Exactly. So this is one of those questions I can't give a super quick answer to because there's a lot of other back and forth that needs to happen to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom line is, if you got a 0.34 phosphate level, NP is the dosing product to go to from our company. But I've got questions about why that level is there and is it correct, and maybe we need to look at that more carefully.
Okay, that makes sense. This is more of a generic one, but Dominic, any negative effects on using vinegar for a long period of time as a carbon dosing source?
I don't like vinegar. I don't like vodka. I don't like sugar. I'd rather drink them and make salad dressing out of the vinegar, drink the vodka, and use the sugar for cupcakes. In my opinion, just my opinion, they don't belong in a tank.
Mm-hmm.
As we talked about before, those type of corn and sugarcane and potato polymers tend to feed a wide range of all kinds of bacteria. And I would rather use a polymer that does a better job in targeting the type of beneficial bacteria that I want to grow rather than all types of bacteria. And there's all kinds of bacteria in the tank. I don't want to grow all of them. I want to grow the ones that are going to take the phosphates out and feed my corals.
Yep. So I guess that would be the potential downfall long term, is you're feeding everything, right? So if some of the quote unquote bad guys take over in your tank, then you're just going to up their numbers as well. So I guess that would be the risk.
And that being said, I mean, I know a lot of tanks that are dosing vodka and dosing vinegar and doing fine. So it's not like, there's very few absolutes, and every tank is different, and I can't tell you what's going to work in your tank specifically, tomorrow. But in general, to me, it's not the best approach. I'd rather use something that's a little bit more targeted. And by the way, the research hasn't been done yet as to exactly which polymer feeds which bacteria, feeds which coral. That research has not been done. But we do make an attempt to focus our polymers to certain types of bacteria that we know corals eat, rather than just kind of a blitzkrieg effect where you're just feeding every type of bacteria in the tank.
No, it's a good way to do it. Okay, Mike was asking, any idea when All for Reef will be back in stock?
Oh man, I'm sorry guys. I know you got turned on to these products and
teasing.
and here's the the real honest to goodness story from the source. There is no shortage of Pro Reef, Alpha Reef, or carbocalcium or trace elements due to the coronavirus. There is no effect on our supply due to the coronavirus. All of the shortages that you're experiencing over here are due to the fact that those products have ramped up in their demand so dramatically in the last year that we literally cannot get enough over here fast enough. What I encourage you to do is to keep in very close touch with your vendor, whoever your vendor is. There's a constant supply coming in. The problem is that the minute it comes in, it's gone. And so you want to keep in contact with your vendor, whether it's a local store or an online source. Make sure that when they get it, because they will be getting it, when they get it, you're on the list to call or you're on the list to get it. There's lots of different sources. There's a number of online sources you can go to, like Marine Depot and Bulk Reef Supply. There's also all of your local fish stores that are Tropic Marin preferred dealers. If you visit tropicmarin-usa.com, tropicmarin-usa.com, any of those, do a search for any of those. If you go to our US website, there's a locator on there for the preferred dealers. Any one of those preferred dealers, find the preferred dealer nearest you. Any one of those preferred dealers can order the product in for you when we have it in stock. And we are working diligently every single day to get more of those products over here. The other thing that has proven very effective for people is we have a recipe on the website for the DIY version, make it your own version of Alpha Reef from the Tropic Marin products that you buy and put it together yourself. You can often, if you can't find the Alpha Reef, you can often find the different components in different sources and make it yourself. And on the US website, we give you the formula of exactly how to do that.
Do you know that off by heart? Do you know what it is offhand? You gotta look it up.
I have to look it up, but
Okay.
also it's a little bit more complicated because you add stuff into, you're going to make 1 liter and you start with like 70 milliliters, add a bunch of stuff in, and then add a little extra water to get up to the 1 liter mark.
Okay.
But the recipe is right on the website, tropicmarinusa.com, and you can download it, print it out, and make it yourself from the components if you can't actually get the Alpha Reef.
Beauty. There you go. Mike just said he bought the 10-liter DIY just in case.
Nice.
Perfect.
Nice.
You're set. Okay. Now on this, I've already sucked a good hour and a half out of you, which I greatly appreciate. So thank you for coming on.
You're welcome.
Now, if people want to dig into this more, I heard rumors that you're doing a Zoom meeting so people can come in and do a direct Q&A with you, which is on the 21st. On
May 21st, Thursday afternoon, May 21st, 3 to 5 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. There's an invite on the Tropic Marin USA website that shows the number of the meeting. And by the way, we always make the number of our meetings our telephone number. So it's 413-367-0101 is the meeting number. Go to Zoom, May 21st, 3 o'clock Eastern Time. And we're going to do a whole presentation about the carbon dosing, just like we did today, Devin. And then open it up to questions. And because it's Zoom, last time we did this, we had guys showing us their tanks, and it's really fun because it's very interactive, it's very personal, and unlike this format, which is awesome, but in this format, you give us a question, and like happened in a couple of times, I'd like to have a couple other pieces of information. On the Zoom, it's very interactive, and we can actually get that information from you. So Thursday, May 21st, 3 in the afternoon, on Zoom, tropicmarinusa.com for the invite. Perfect. And for those that didn't find a pen to scramble and write it down, I will put that in the description after I finish up the live stream. So that was good. Now, there is 145 watching and 41 likes. So if you guys enjoyed it, hit that like button. Show Lou some love. Appreciate you coming on today. Always love having you. You're an endless fountain of information. Thanks so much, Kevin. It's been great. I'm always happy to come on anytime. Let's talk about what the next subject might be.
Sounds good. We will work on that for the near future. All
Awesome.
right, guys. All right, guys. Thanks everyone who joined us tonight. Thank you again, Lou.
Bye bye, Devin. You're welcome. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night.